welcome back to my channel. Finishing up Caliban by Silvia Federici, chapter 5, hopefully. Oh yeah, definitely. Like, we're about to end this book, you guys. Like, literally, like 10 pages. So, this section is called Women and Witches in America. It is not a coincidence that most of the people convicted in the investigation of 1660 in Huarochirí were women. 28 out of 32. In the same way as women had been the main presence in the Taki Onkoi movement, it was women who most strongly defended the old mode of existence and opposed the new power structure, plausibly because they were also the ones who were most negatively affected by it. Women had held a powerful position in pre-Columbian societies, as reflected by the existence of many important female deities in their religions. Reaching an island off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula in 1517, Hernández de Cordoba named it Isla Mujeres because the temples they visited there contained numerous female idols. Pre-conquest American women had their organizations, their socially recognized spheres of activity, and while not equal to men, they were considered complementary to them in their contribution to the family and society. In addition to being farmers, houseworkers, and weavers, in charge of producing the colorful cloths worn in everyday life and during the ceremonies, they were potters, herbalists, healers, curanderas, and priestesses, sacerdotisas, at the service of household gods. In southern Mexico, in the region of Oaxaca, they were connected with the production of pulque magui, a sacred substance believed to have been invented by the gods and associated with Mayahuel, an earth mother goddess that was the focal point of peasant religion. But with the Spaniards' arrival, everything changed, as they brought their baggage of misogynist beliefs and restructured the economy and political power in ways that favored men. Women suffered also at the hands of the traditional chiefs, who, in order to maintain their power, began to take over the communal lands and expropriate the female members of the community from land use and water rights. Thus, within the colonial economy, women were reduced to the condition of servants working as maids for the encomenderos, the priests, the corregidores, or as weavers in the obrajes. Women were also forced to follow their husband when they would have to do mita work in the mines, a fate that people recognized to be worse than death. For in 1528, the authorities established that spouses could not be separated, so that women and children from then on could be compelled to do mine labor in addition to preparing food for the male workers. Another source of degradation for women was the new Spanish legislation, which declared polygamy illegal, so that overnight men had to either separate from their wives or reclassify them as maids, while the children issued from these unions were labeled according to 5 different types of illegitimacy. Ironically, while polygamous unions were dissolved, with the arrival of the Spaniards, no Aboriginal woman was safe from rape or appropriation, so that many men, instead of marrying, began to turn to public prostitutes. In the European fantasy, America itself was a reclining, naked woman, seductively inviting the approaching white stranger. At times, it was the Indian men themselves who delivered their female kin to the priests or encomenderos in exchange for some economic reward or a public post. For all these reasons, women became the main enemies of colonial rule, refusing to go to Mass, to baptize their children, or to cooperate in any way with the colonial authorities and priests. In the Andes, some committed suicide and killed their male children, presumably to prevent them from going to the mines, and also out of disgust, apparently, for the mistreatment inflicted upon them by their male relatives. Others organized their communities and, in front of the defection of many local chiefs who were co-opted by the colonial structure, became priests, leaders, and guardians of the huacas, taking on functions which they had never previously exercised. This explains why women were the backbone of the Taqi Ancoy movement. In Peru, they also held confessions to prepare people for when they would meet with the Catholic priests, advising them as to what it should be safe to tell them and what they should not reveal. And while before the conquest, women had been in charge exclusively of the ceremonies dedicated to female deities, afterwards, they became assistants or principal officiants in cults dedicated to the male ancestors, huacas, something that before the conquest had been forbidden. They also fought the colonial power by withdrawing to the higher plains, punas, where they could practice the old religion. As Irene Silverblatt writes, while indigenous men often fled the oppression of the mita and tribute by abandoning their communities and going to work as yaconas, quasi-serfs, in the merging haciendas, women fled to the punas, inaccessible and very distant from the reducciones of their native communities. Once in the punas, women rejected the forces and symbols of their oppression, disobeying Spanish administrators, the clergy, as well as their own community officials. They also vigorously rejected the colonial ideology, which reinforced their oppression, refusing to go to Mass, participate in Catholic confessions, or learn Catholic dogma. More important, women did not just reject Catholicism, they returned to their native religion, and to the best that they could, to the quality of social relations which their religion expressed. By persecuting women as witches, then, the Spaniards targeted both the practitioners of the old religion and the instigators of anti-colonial revolt, while attempting to redefine the spheres of activity in which indigenous women could participate. As Silverblatt points out, the concept of witchcraft was alien to Andean society. In Peru, as well as in every pre-industrial society, many women were specialists in medical knowledge, being familiar with the properties of herbs and plants, and they were also diviners, but the Christian notion of the devil was unknown to them. Nevertheless, by the 17th century, under the impact of torture, intense persecution, and forced acculturation, the Andean women arrested, mostly old and poor, were accusing themselves of the same crimes with which women were being charged in the European witch trials. Pacts and copulation with the devil, prescribing herbal remedies, using ointments, flying through the air, making wax images. They also confessed to worshiping stones, mountains, and springs, and feeding the huacas. Worst of all, they confessed to bewitching the authorities or other men of power and causing them to die. As it was in Europe, torture and terror were used to force the accused to deliver other names, so that the circles of the persecution became wider and wider. But one of the objectives of the witch hunt, the isolation of the witches from the rest of the community, was not achieved. The Andean witches were not turned into outcasts. On the contrary, they were actively sought for as comadres, and their presence was required in informal village reunions. For in the consciousness of the colonized, witchcraft, the maintenance of ancient traditions, and conscious political resistance became increasingly intertwined. Indeed, it was largely due to women's resistance that the old religion was preserved. Changes occurred in the meaning of the practices associated with it. Worship was driven underground at the expense of its collective nature in pre-conquest times, but the ties with the mountains and the other sites of the Huacas were not destroyed. We find a similar situation in central and southern Mexico, where women, priestesses above all, played an important role in the defense of their communities and cultures. In this region, according to Antonio Garcia de Leon's Resistencia y Utopia, from the conquest on, women directed or counseled all the great anti-colonial revolts. In Oaxaca, the presence of women in popular rebellions continued into the 18th century when, in 1 out of 4 cases, they led the attack against the authorities and were visibly more aggressive, insulting, and rebellious. In Chiapas, too, they were the key actors in the preservation of the old religion and the anti-colonization struggle. Thus, when in 1524, the Spaniards launched a war campaign to subjugate the rebellious Chiapanecos, it was a priestess who led the troops against them. Women also participated in the underground networks of idol worshippers and resistors that periodically were discovered by the clergy. In 1584, for instance, upon visiting Chiapas, the Bishop Pedro de Feria was told that several among the local Indian chiefs were still practicing the old cults, and that they were being counseled by women with whom they entertained filthy practices such as Sabbath-like ceremonies during which they mixed together and turned into gods and goddesses, the women being in charge of sending rain and giving wealth to those who asked for it. It is ironic then, in view of this record, that Caliban and not his mother, Sycorax, the witch, should be taken by Latin American revolutionaries as a symbol of the resistance to colonization. For Caliban could only fight his master by cursing him in the language he had learned from him, thus being dependent in his rebellion on his master's tools. He could also be deceived into believing that his liberation could come through a rape and through the initiative of some opportunistic white proletarians transplanted in the New World whom he worshipped as gods. Sycorax instead, a witch so strong that she could control the moon, make flows and ebbs, might have taught her son to appreciate the local powers, the land, the waters, the trees, nature's treasuries, and those communal ties that, over centuries of suffering, have continued to nourish the liberation struggle to this day, and that already haunted as a promise Caliban's imagination. Be not afeared, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again, and then, dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when waked I cried to dream again. The Tempest, Act 3. The European witches and the Indios. Did the witch hunts in the New World have an impact on events in Europe? Or were the two persecutions simply drawing from the same pool of repressive strategies and tactics which the European ruling class had forged since the Middle Ages with the persecution of the heretics? I ask these questions having in mind the thesis advanced by the Italian historian Luciano Parinetto, who argues that witch hunting in the New World had a major impact on the elaboration of the witchcraft ideology in Europe, as well as the chronology of the European witch hunt. Briefly put, Parinetto's thesis is that it was under the impact of the American experience that the witch hunt in Europe became a mass phenomenon in the second part of the 16th century. For in America, the authorities and the clergy found the confirmation for their views about devil worship, coming to believe in the existence of entire populations of witches, a conviction which they then applied in their Christianization drive at home. Thus, another import from the New World, described by missionaries as the land of the devil, was the adoption by the European state of extermination as a political strategy, which presumably inspired the massacre of the Huguenots and the massification of the witch hunt starting in the last decades of the 16th century. Evidence of a crucial connection between the two persecutions is, in Paranetto's view, the use made by the demonologists in Europe of the reports from the Indies. Paranetto focuses on Jean Baudin, but he also mentions Francesco Maria Guazzo and cites as an example of the boomerang effect produced by the transplanting of the witch hunt in America the case of the Inquisitor Pierre Lancre, who during a several months persecution in the region of Labour, Basque country, denounced its entire population as witches. Not last, Paranetto cites as evidence of his thesis a set of themes that in the second half of the 16th century became prominent in the repertoire of witchcraft in Europe. Cannibalism, the offering of children to the devil, the reference to ointments and drugs, and the identification of homosexuality or sodomy with diabolism, all of which he argues had their matrix in the New World. What to make of this theory and where to draw the line between what is accountable and what is speculative? This is a question that future scholarship will have to settle. Here I limit myself to a few observations. Paranetto's thesis is important since it helps us dispel the Eurocentrism that has characterized the study of the witch hunt and can potentially answer some of the questions raised by the persecution of the European witches. But its main contribution is that it broadens our awareness of the global character of capitalist development and makes us realize that by the 16th century, a ruling class had formed in Europe that was at all points involved, practically, politically, and ideologically, in the formation of a world proletariat, and therefore was continually operating with knowledge gathered on an international level in the elaboration of its models of domination. As for its claims, we can observe that the history of Europe before the conquest is sufficient proof that the Europeans did not have to cross the oceans to find the will to exterminate those standing in their way. It is also possible to account for the chronology of the witch hunt in Europe without resorting to the New World impact hypothesis. Since the decades between the 1560s and 1620s saw a widespread impoverishment and social dislocations throughout most of Western Europe. More suggestive in provoking a rethinking of the European witch hunt from the viewpoint of witch hunting in America are the thematic and iconographic correspondences between the two. The theme of self-anointing is one of the most revealing, as the descriptions of the behavior of the Aztec or Incan priests on the occasion of human sacrifices evoke those found in some demonologies describing the preparations of the witches for the Sabbat. Consider the following passage found in Acosta, which reads the American practice as a perversion of the Christian habit of consecrating priests by anointing them. The idol priests in Mexico anoint themselves in the following ways. He just said oint, like not anoint, he just said oint. They grease themselves from the feet to the head, including the hair. The substance with which they stained themselves was ordinary tea, because from antiquity It was always an offering to their gods, and for this much worshipped. This was their ordinary greasing, except when they went to sacrifice or went to the caves where they kept their idols, when they used a different greasing to give themselves courage. This grease was made of poisonous substances, frogs, salamanders, vipers. With this greasing, they could turn into magicians or brujos and speak with the devil. The same poisonous brew was presumably spread by the European witches on their bodies, according to their accusers, in order to gain the power to fly to the Sabbat. But it cannot be assumed that this theme was generated in the New World, as references to women making ointments from the blood of toads or children's bones are found already in the 15th century trials and demonologies. What is plausible instead is that the reports from America did revitalize these charges, adding new details and giving more authority to them. The same consideration may serve to explain the iconographic correspondence between the pictures of the Sabbat and the various representations of the cannibal family and clan that began to appear in Europe in the later 16th century. And it can account for many other coincidences, such as the fact that both in Europe and America, witches were accused of sacrificing children to the devil. This portrait of witches surrounding the remains of bodies excavated from the ground or taken from the gallows is reminiscent of the cannibal bouquet. Cannibals preparing their meal. Preparation for the Sabbat. Preparing for a cannibal meal. Yum. Witch hunting and globalization. Witch hunting in America continued in waves through the end of the 17th century, when the persistence of demographic decline and increased political and economic security on the side of the colonial power structure combined to put an end to the persecution. Thus, in the same region that had witnessed the great anti-idolatry campaigns of the 16th and 17th centuries, by the 18th, the Inquisition had renounced any attempts to influence the moral and religious beliefs of the population, apparently estimating that they could no longer pose a danger to colonial rule. In the place of the persecution, a paternalistic perspective emerged that looked at idolatry and magical practices as the foibles of ignorant people, not worthy of being taken into consideration by la gente de razón. From then on, the preoccupation with devil worshipping would migrate to the developing slave plantations of Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, where, starting with King Philip's Wars, the English settlers justified their massacres of the Native American Indians by labeling them as servants of the devil. The Salem trials were also explained by the local authorities on this ground, with the argument that the New Englanders had settled into the land of the devil. As Cotton Mather wrote years later, recalling the events in Salem, "I have met with some strange things which have made me think that this inexplicable war, i.e. the war made by the spirits of the invisible world against the people of Salem, might have its origins among the Indians, whose chief sagamores are well known unto some of our captive to have been horrid sorcerers and hellish conjurers and such as conversed with the demons." It is significant in this context that the Salem trials were sparked by the divinations of a West Indian slave, Tituba, who was among the first to be arrested, and that the last execution of a witch in an English-speaking territory was that of a black slave, Sarah Bassett, killed in Bermuda in 1730. By the 18th century, in fact, the witch was becoming an African practitioner of obeah, a ritual that the planters feared and demonized as an incitement to rebellion. Witch hunting did not disappear from the repertoire of the bourgeoisie with the abolition of slavery. On the contrary, the global expansion of capitalism through colonization and Christianization ensured that this persecution would be planted in the body of colonized societies and in time would be carried out by the subjugated communities in their own names and against their own members. In the 1840s, for instance, a wave of witch burnings occurred in Western India. More women in this period were burned as witches than in the practice of sati. These killings occurred in the context of the social crisis caused both by the colonial authorities' attack on the communities living in the forests, among whom women had a far higher degree of power than the caste societies that dwelled in the plains, and the colonial devaluation of female power, resulting in the decline of the worship of female goddesses. Witch hunting also took hold in Africa, where it survives today as a key instrument of division in many countries, especially those once implicated in the slave trade, like Nigeria and Southern Africa. Here, too, witch hunting has accompanied the decline in the status of women, brought about by the rise of capitalism and the intensifying struggle for resources, which in recent years has been aggravated by the imposition of the neoliberal agenda. As a consequence of the life and death competition for vanishing resources, scores of women, generally old and poor, have been hunted down in the 1990s in northern Transvaal, where 70 were burned just in the first 4 months of 1994. Witch hunts have also been reported in Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon in the 80s and 90s, concomitant with the imposition by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank of the policy of structural adjustment, which has led to a new round of enclosures and caused an unprecedented impoverishment among the population. The Africanization of the witch. Note her unusual earrings, cap, and features suggesting a kinship between the female communards and the wild African women who instilled in the slaves the courage to revolt, haunting the imagination of the French bourgeoisie. In Nigeria, by the 1980s, innocent girls were confessing to having killed dozens of people, while in other African countries, petitions were addressed to governments, begging them to persecute more strongly the witches. Meanwhile, in South Africa and Brazil, older women were murdered by neighbors and kin under the charge of witchcraft. At the same time, a new kind of witch beliefs is presently developing, resembling that documented by Michael Tautzig in Bolivia, whereby poor people suspect the nouveau riche of having gained their wealth through illicit supernatural means and accuse them of wanting to transform their victims into zombies in order to put them to work. The witch hunts that are presently taking place in Africa or Latin America are rarely reported in Europe and the United States. In the same way as the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries for a long time were of little interest to historians, even when they are reported, their significance is generally missed. So widespread is the belief that such phenomena belong to a far-gone era and have nothing to do with us. But if we apply to the present the lessons of the past, we realize that the reappearance of witch hunting in so many parts of the world in the 80s and 90s is a clear sign of a process of primitive accumulation, which means that the privatization of land and other communal resources, mass impoverishment, plunder, and the sowing of divisions in once cohesive communities are again on the world agenda. If things continue this way, the elders in a Senegalese village commented to an American anthropologist, expressing their fears for the future, "Our children will eat each other." And indeed, that is what is accomplished by a witch hunt, whether it is conducted from above as a means to criminalize resistance to expropriation, or is conducted from below as a means to appropriate diminishing resources, as seems to be the case in some parts of Africa today. In some countries, this process still requires the mobilization of witches, spirits, and devils. But we should not delude ourselves that this is not our concern. As Arthur Miller already saw in his interpretation of the Salem trials, as soon as we strip the persecution of witches from its metaphysical trappings, we recognize in it phenomena that are very close to home. That's the end of this book. Thank you so much for watching. I want to read other books. Let me know if you have requests. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.